Melanie Parker, Google's Chief Diversity Officer. And in honor of Women's History Month, I am thrilled to be here today with three inspirational top leaders in business and academia. And they're going to discuss their book, Arrive and Thrive, 7 Impactful Practices for Women Navigating Leadership. It's such a timely guide that reveals 7 practices that you can use to thrive as you rise to positions of greater responsibility, risk, and reward, and empower one another along the way. Susan MacKenty Brady, Janet Foutty, and Dr. Lynn Perry Wooten, welcome, and thank you for sharing your wisdom with us today.
Thank you so much for having us. It's great to be here.
Awesome. So ladies, what prompted you three to write this book? Just tell us a little bit about the backstory of Arrive and Thrive.
So I'll take that one. Hi, Melanie. I'm so glad to be with you all today. Happy Women's History Month, everyone. The entire Arrive and Thrive project was inspired by the legacy of the late Ellen Gabriel, who founded Deloitte's first women's initiative. And the Deloitte Ellen Gabriel Chair for Women in Leadership at Simmons University was established in 2005 by her Deloitte colleagues. And I was very honored to be named the chair in 2019. And it was in a conversation with 2 very senior women partners at Deloitte that this idea of collaborating on a book emerged. And, what evolved was Janet and Lynn and I connecting with our collective 85 years of leadership experience. And what emerged was, 7 practices. And then we interviewed 20 plus sitting C-level executives. So that turned into 600 years of wisdom, distilled into 200 pages for really any busy professional woman to have as her handbook. It's our attempt to start honest conversations. It's our attempt to help women to get the resources and advice and support they need to thrive. Because we all agree that for far too long, women leaders have had to focus on survival, and we want women to thrive when they arrive in leadership. So that's how it all began.
I really love the connotation of arrive and thrive. And I mean, just in the title, like it really pulls you in. But Janet, can you talk to us about why is this book so urgent for women during the pandemic and in our current economic and socio-political climate?
So, you certainly hit, Melanie, on the broad set of things that are coming at each of us every day in terms of the complexities that we're facing. And we actually started this book right about the start of the pandemic. The date of our first meeting was just after things had shut down. And I think that actually inspired us even more to push forward, though we certainly didn't know what the next 2 years would bring. And I would really say that there's 2 things that make this book even relevant in this moment. The first is, of course, we know that women have suffered more in the pandemic in terms of their participation in the workforce and their advancement over the last 2 years. And the care phenomenon that has really impacted women in terms of the responsibilities they've had to play has put an even brighter spotlight on making sure that organizations are very focused on women. And of course, men and women leaders are focused on women's success as well. But the other thing that I think doesn't get talked enough about is the breadth of topics that each of us are facing today are so complicated and so intertwined. We could spend our entire hour just on that having diverse and varied voices at the table matters now more than ever, because we know that a diverse set of voices in the conversation leads to much better outcomes. So those are, for me, the sort of 2 drivers that make this that much more important in this moment.
I love hearing that. And it makes me think a lot about balance and balanced leadership. And Lynn, how do the principles in this book really chart a path to a more balanced approach to leadership?
Yeah. I've been studying women for a quarter of a century, and sad to say. And Janet, the same problems that you mentioned exist, the she-cession, the pay equity, the glass ceiling. One of the unique things about this book is we focused on the me and the we. So we think about, one, what does it mean to be your best self and to lead authentically? How do you deal with leadership during a crisis period, but also building that winning team and being inclusive? So that balanced approach When you think about the trajectory of women in leadership, at first, young in your career, you have to be an individual contributor. Then you have to learn how to lead a team. And then you have to learn how to be a leader and understand systems. And we address all of that in the book. And then you have to go home and usually have caring responsibilities. And so we even talk about things like that. The other thing that makes this book unique, and Susan and Janet are being modest, is that we take a three-pronged approach. We have lots of in-depth interviews and qualitative research and stories, but this book is backed by theory, and then we give women tools to apply the 7 principles.
It's so great to hear. And I love this, toggle between the personal and the professional. And certainly, as many of us have worked from home and we're doing this toggling across many dimensions of our life, that's critically important. It makes me think about, like, how is Arrive and Thrive different from other books about organizational leadership?
Well, so I'll jump in and take that one. First of all, I'm not sure I want to start using the years, Susan and Lynn, that we've all been doing this, because it looks so great on paper, and then I hear it and I'm like, oh, does that just mean I'm old?
Yeah.
Wise, experienced, mature. And to tie that into this question, I will tell you that the books that I like the best have 2 dimensions. And by the way, Lynn and Susan are well-published and established authors, though I write a tremendous amount within my own organization for my clients, and externally. I have never authored a book, so I learned a lot about that from my good friends Lynn and Susan. But the things I like the best are 2 things. One is storytelling, and the second is lists. And I know that sounds very, I don't know, maybe funny or sort of odd, but what we really worked to do was to share our personal stories and to draw out the stories of the amazing executives that, frankly, jumped at the opportunity to participate in this book with us. I think took all of us by surprise in terms of the interest. And then maybe one of my big contributions, in addition to content, was the push for lists, so that not only do you read it and get the great tools and advice that Lynn was talking about, but there are also lists of ideas of things you can do that you can refer back to that are very practical and sort of no nonsense. So those are the 2 things that are important to me: great storytelling and great lists that you can use on an ongoing basis. Lynn, the academic, is probably cringing at hearing me say that's what it all boils down to. But from my business sensibility, that's how I think about what makes us unique and different.
And it's backed by theory.
Yeah, and of course, great research.
Yes.
And Lynn, don't cringe, but I actually get like euphoria when I check off my list. So when those little check marks give me a lot of happiness. So I think it's such a critical point. Susan, you kickstart Arrive and Thrive by talking about something that I love, which is this concept of investing in our best selves. But what does this really mean?
Well, so I have to say, Melanie, I love this concept as well. Look, when I think about best self, and when we articulated it in the book, we really think about it as two sides of the same coin. So one side is where you lead in your heart and mind. This is how you think and feel. So you're aware of your strengths and talents. You're aware of what brings you energy. You're aware of how your strengths add value to others. You're centered, and you feel you are no better or less than another human, and you stand in and up for your worthiness. That happens inside of us. That's the felt experience of best self. The other side is what you say and do, and how others see you when you are leading from your best self. And this is, you're mindful of your energy and your impact on others. You're confident in your value and displaying your strengths and how you add value to others. And then you're respectful and of others, and you look to invite in the best self of others. So be that inside our hearts and minds, or how people experience us. Leading from our best self is where our strengths and talents really meet, where we feel called to bring those strengths and talents to add value to others, which meets where we experience joy and vitality. And where those things converge, we think of as really the place we thrive, the best self zone. I also think of it as a version of our well-being. So that's how we think about our best self, and that the practice is dedicated to 2 parts. One is kind of digging in and understanding who am I at my best? And the other is, okay, once I know her, I want to Velcro to her. I want to be her all the time. How do I get back there when I get kicked out of my best self?
I love this convergence. I mean, it's really powerful. And, think about it from like this inside out living and the way we really tangibly think about that. I mean, you also talk about like a better way of boosting performance. So, managers typically focus on strengthening their employees' like weaknesses to drive results. But what you're saying is that there's actually a better way to do this that boosts overall performance. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, I mean, the strengths-based development builds off of research showing that while people remember criticism, they respond to praise, and that each person's greatest room for growth is the areas of their unique strengths. And by and large, I think we sort of under leverage strengths. And strengths can emerge from talents, competencies, principles, identities, but often they're overlooked. And when in fact we should focus on honing on them and helping others to, bring them in so we all can perform at high levels. So, Lynn and I have had a lot of conversations about strengths. She's kind of a strengths junkie, but she gives that up in the book because, that's her like tool she recommends. But they're really clues to your best self. And when we perform from our best self, we will intrinsically be motivated to do it with gusto. I mean, in a world where, especially our pandemic world, Melanie, where post-pandemic, we're really looking for the discretionary effort of, by and large, exhausted teammates. And the more we can help people return to their strengths and honor them and encourage them, I think the more we're going to see energy.
I love it. I think it's true. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
There's just one thing I wanted to tag on Best Self, which Susan clearly has really pushed my own thinking to this end. And there's two things that I wanted to just highlight that I took away from the work that we did together on this. And one is that time spent reflecting is not time wasted. And I think as, Melanie, you were talking about sort of women running 1,000,000 miles an hour and this idea that time for reflection and actually working through thinking about your strengths and what gives you energy is not time wasted. And the other, and maybe even more importantly, is when you really invest in your best self, you can keep your not so constructive voices quiet that so many of us have. So those are just two sort of additional threads of best self that I wanted to highlight while we were talking about it, that I really push my own thinking in writing this book, and I think is a really important message and part of the conversation.
I love that addition. I mean, sometimes I sit down, quiet from the inside out, just so I can hear myself think, because sometimes I miss my own thinking because I'm just going. And so I think, even just that practice of sitting down with ourselves and that inside out practice is so important. And, one of the other things we're seeing today is just this bigger push in the workplace about how do we bring our most authentic selves to work? But a lot of us, women in particular, like we really struggle with what this actually means. And so what are the do's and don'ts of embracing authenticity?
Yeah. That is a great question. And the way I think about it is it starts with what Susan and Janet said. You have to know your best self and you have to know your strengths. So that's the first one. Next is we talk a lot in the book about your values and being true to yourself. And when you're doing that inner work and that reflection and that time that you and Melanie and you and Janet are talking about, I say that people should be able to identify 3 to 5 values, their purpose, their North Star, and why they are here and how they want to live. So for example, my values are excellence, community, and learning. And whatever I do, I think about that as being part of my authentic self. And then beyond your values are, we all bring our identities to work. So I'm a mother, I'm a wife, I'm African-American, I'm a woman, I'm a daughter, all those type of things. My faith, you have to know your identity and who you are. Now at work, I want you to bring your professional best self. So be authentic, but also be professional. And so our book, we talk about how do you identify your value? How do you identify your strengths? How do you bring your identity? But also thinking about what is that work presence? What is that executive presence? And then how can you live this integrative life? Because there is no more work-life balance. We truly learned that in the pandemic. So part of being authentic is learning how to live this integrative life.
Thank you for that. I mean, Janet, you talk about authenticity being a critical component of advancing in your career. And so this integrative work that Lynn is talking about, how do you think embracing it served you while you were CEO of Deloitte Consulting and now as executive chair of the board of Deloitte US? Like, what are your thoughts here?
I think it's important to highlight first that I did not grow up and was not sort of born into a business environment. I'm the daughter of a scientist and an artist, and I truly thought being in business was knocking on doors and selling vacuum cleaners door to door. And so for those who are not as tenured and don't have many years experience, but that was my view of what business was. And so when I started my business career, I really only knew how to be myself based on some of the principles that were installed by my family. Lynn, I didn't know what the expectations were. And so for me, clarity, thoughtfulness, and many of the fundamentals that really stick with me today, preparedness. As I moved into more significant leadership roles, both in management and in governance, I will tell you that being able to be my authentic self, both in terms of the values that I carried and the transparency with which I carried myself, when I was in a business leader role, engendered a level of trust amongst my team that if I had not sort of created the space for my own authenticity, I don't believe that we would have been able to drive the level of change and the advancement in the business, because the team just worked in a very different level. It created the space for everyone to be much more authentic, comfortable, and that leads to being comfortable and being confident, which we know and is well studied leads to better outcomes. As the chair, in the last couple of years, authenticity has taken sort of a different lens because I took this role as chair when we were at this confluence of crises. Being approachable, being empathetic, really listening in, frankly, a very different way, even though I think of myself as a very good listener. I've had to listen in a really different way. All those dimensions of my own authenticity have allowed me to create back to confidence in the organization, that we're all in this together, that I could be really open and transparent about what we know and what we don't know, which in my mind is a critical dimension to leading through crisis. So that's a different take. In my business leadership role, it was about growth and ambition and pushing the boundaries and creating the space to challenge each other. As the chair role in a crisis, it has been about listening and learning and being really clear about what we know and what we don't know, which has all come from a place of really strong authenticity.
Thank you for really, clarifying that, because I think it's really important for each of us as we think about like the different roles we play or we formally played and what we're going into, to think about like those distinctions and, what is each of those roles, carry. Susan, in the book on page 64, I found this really striking. It said, cultivating courage allows you to take risk, not in the absence of fear, but despite it. And that real impact does not manifest without making difficult decisions. So how does cultivating courage drive results?
So first of all, I just have to say, I didn't know you were going to take this question of all the things you could ask us before. And it probably was my favorite conversation that I had with Janet and Lynn. Janet, I don't know if you recall this, but we had this conversation about, courage is not the absence of fear. At the end of the day, it's really the presence of vulnerability. But when it comes to how it cultivates driving results, the connection between courage and results, in many ways, when we're courageous, we speak up about what isn't working, or we suggest doing more of what is working. We speak up about ideas and innovations that could create value and efficiency. It also takes up courage when we speak up about systems or processes or people that are holding the organization back from achieving its goals. So when we take risks, we have a shot at adding more value. When we act with courage, we have a shot at adding more value. And so there's a direct correlation to impact.
Thank you for like delving into that. And I'm sure everyone as they go read it, like will really reflect back on this conversation. Janet, talk to us about what it means to be competently courageous.
So I love the alliteration. So we've been cultivating courage and competently courageous. It's fabulous. So in the book, we talk about Jim DeTert's research, and he's the author of a book I would highly recommend called Choosing Courage. He's at University of Virginia, just down the street from where you are today, Melanie, at the Darden School of Business. So when he coined this term, competently courageous, it's really about when people create the right conditions for action by establishing a really strong internal reputation and being thoughtful about the how and when to take action, and maybe my favorite, managing the follow through. He really breaks it down. And one of the things he talks about is choosing your battles, discerning whether an opportunity to act makes sense in context, and maximizing the odds of success by managing the messaging and the emotions. So you take that as a very thoughtful, well-researched Lynn perspective. Then I tie it back to when I was a young leader, and I do talk a lot about family, so just bear with me a little bit. Just over a decade ago, I took the time to write the leadership lessons that I learned from my dad, who is a scientist, and he was at a really important inflection point in his career, and many people were writing what they'd learned from him. Most of them were scientists, and I decided to write down what I'd learned from him and how it applied to business. And as we finished the book, I actually went back and looked at that list because I certainly didn't have Jim's wisdom or research behind me. But what I wrote down over a decade ago was never let politics or agendas stand in the way of doing what is right, and be a loudmouth when you think it really matters. And that when it really matters is, I think, what he was really getting at. It's not all the time, it's not every battle, but it's when it really matters. So my dinner table conversations as a kid growing up, somehow that got imprinted in my brain from a scientific point of view, and well sort of thought out in his research. And it is about picking the places and the spots, being incredibly well prepared, and follow through. All those things incredibly important around courage.
Well, the moments that matter, I think, are something that we all have this takeaway around, and could even mean different things to to each of us as we think about that. So I think it's really critical. Lynn, you talk about these 4 modes to greater resilience, and your crisis leadership research points to these 4 modes of action that women leaders can adopt to rise with like even greater resilience. Like, what are they? And then could you just talk about like why do they work?
Yeah. It's been hard for all of us the last 2 years. And resiliency has become one of the buzzwords.
Yeah.
So when we think about going through difficult times like we have to acknowledge that first there's fear. I always joke, why were people hoarding toilet paper and paper towels? We had that fear. We had never lived in a pandemic before. Acknowledge the fear, embrace it. What does the fear look like? Paralysis analysis. You don't want to hear what's happening. You're in denial mode. You have anxiety. So that first part is the fear mode. But the crisis is not going away, as we learn. And so the second mode is taking some time to do some inner work. Restoration. I love naps. So my thing is when I'm in crisis, when I have to go take a nap, and then the nap helps me to restore myself, to re-energize. Each of us as women leaders need to know when we have to take that pause, that deep breath. Some people exercise, some people talk to their girlfriends, but that restoration phase. And then once you've restored yourself, Melanie, you have to say, okay, what do I need to learn to get through this crisis? What do I need to do? And we all have to invest in learning. How many of us knew how to do telemed before the crisis and all the things we had learned? I had never used DoorDash or all those different type of things.
And I love both of them now. I
love.
Right.
I was like, I don't want to see you in person, doctor. I'd rather do telemed. Right before, if you would have told me that I wanted to do telemed, I would have said no. We had to learn it. I had to learn how to run a university in the middle of a pandemic.
Yes.
So all this learning is the third mode. And Melanie, and then the growth opportunities. Within every crisis, I know from my research with Dean Erica James, there's an opportunity. And there's a reason, there's a way and a pathway to grow. And you have to start to think about what is that growth opportunity and who else do I need to bring on? My supporting cast through the 4 modes are so important.
So, and never let a good crisis go wasted, right? Like when we're in
Right.
that, because all of it, to your point, is learning. You know what? My restoration, I knit and I've been quilting because there's
See?
something either because it's tactile, right? Either
Right.
like the knitting or most recently the quilting, just sewing these strips of fabric together just gives me that chance to like think differently, use different parts of my brain. I go to like crafting classes, but for the very same reasons that you're talking about.
That is exactly. My daughter is the same way. When she needs to restore herself, she takes out the sewing machine.
Yes,
She has to create something. And so
that's
we
right.
all need to go into that second mode of restoration and what brings us energy and joy.
Oh yes. I mean, on page 105 in the book, you talk about like resilience being a required disruptor in our lives, kind of push us out of the survival mode and into the thriving mode. Can you talk about what that means?
And this builds upon what Janet and Susan talked about because resilience and these crises make us courageous. And you think about whenever we've had big growth in our life, it was doing something different. For me, it's been moving in my career. When I moved in my career, that pushed me to a new level. I had to have that courage that Janet and Susan talked about. I had to learn how to be resilient. I had to grow. And so think about those disruptors in your life, disruptors in industry, disruptors in your organization. And as women leaders, we need the courage and we need the resilience to be conquerors. And that's what the book talks about when we combine those 2 chapters, the stretching, the skill set that you need. And once again, that personal board of directors that's going to help you stretch and be courageous. You don't have to do it alone, is what we talk about in the book.
That's right. Community, just the power of community and the power that we draw from the
Yeah.
collective and not knowing we were isolated. I was looking at a stat recently that talked about how many people, are living alone, through the pandemic and how just that isolation has really impacted people's well-being in an adverse way. And so I think it's important that we all remember just the community that we have. Susan, is there anything that surprised you about vision?
So a lot. The we had an interesting conversation about this as well, and then with our with the insights from the thrivers, we in each chapter, Melanie, as you know, we have thrivers wisdom on top of the lists, on top of the research, on top. We really, it's a distillation, and I think the thing that made sense to me once I knew it, but I wouldn't have been able to say it like I'm about to say it, that surprised me the most is that vision is really just a process of discovery about what needs to change, and then figuring out how best to change it, right? And that it's a learned skill. You don't have to be a visionary. You don't have to wake up and have the aha moment to be a leader who inspires a bold vision. In fact, I got out of this research, both for myself doing the work that Janet and Lynn just talked about, taking pause, reflecting, really thinking about what I value, all of this, right? That's the vision I have for myself. What do I want to change in my life? But also for the Institute for Inclusive Leadership, which I run. What is our next, what needs to change? What do we need to do next? What I found was listening is my best friend. Asking questions is great. I don't have to have the answers. In fact, the future really belongs to the learners. And so our ability to manifest vision is directly connected to our ability to learn from the people around us. That I don't know if on average people would say, directly when talking about vision,
I love it. And so many times we're not listening, right? Like we're waiting on our chance to talk and we're polite about it, some of us, but we're not actually listening, which I think to your point, like really requires like a different intention and a different skill. When you think about practicing though, like what do you think is the number one skill to practicing inspiring a bold vision?
So I'll jump in. Oh,
yeah, good.
You go ahead. Finish the thread. You were on it well, Susan. Go right ahead.
You know what? I have to admit, I think this is what Janet might say, but you can argue with me here, Janet. Getting out there and talking to people and asking a lot of questions about how the operation is working and not working. Janet, what were you going to say?
I would say that, and then I would say, because you had already sort of highlighted that in your previous answer, I would say spending the time to think about then how to communicate where you think the gaps are to then begin solutioning for that vision. That communication piece, we haven't talked too much about that today, but really being thoughtful around what you've heard, where the gaps are, and how you communicate that to a wide variety of audiences.
Yeah, storytelling.
And
no, I will have to tell you, all the storytelling today about knitting and sewing. My mother's a fiber artist, and I can barely sew a button on, and so I'm feeling like I'm not up to par with this crowd in your storytelling about some of your hobbies. But generally, storytelling is good.
You probably had enough of it growing up, and we're all craving it as adults.
No, I tried, just not in the DNA or the patients or both.
Well, let's deep dive on the 6 essential actions. And so, this practice, you treat it differently. Like why? So if you talk about like the creation of 6 essential actions and what those are and why we do that.
Yeah. We talk about teams, and Melanie, let me confess with you, I'm the sole academic on the team, like your daughter. And I never thought I was going to have to lead a team. I thought I'd just be in my lab writing or teaching. And then all of a sudden I got into administration and realized that a lot of leadership and a lot of thriving, and women forget, is not only about being a contributor and being successful, but about leading that winning team. And so the investments we talk about in the chapter about leading the team is first really is that you have to understand each person's strengths in the team. And then, part of this understanding strengths is that when you lead a team, 1 + 1 should be greater than 2. So using those strengths to make synergy. So the checklist. So that's the first thing. I'm doing Janet's checklist here. The second is going back to vision at the team level. As leaders, we have to set direction and strategy. Everyone has to know what is the winning proposition, where is the team going, and how are we going to get there? And then I love meetings. I like to communicate. I like the phone. I like Zoom. I like in-person meetings. Because when we come together and we communicate, that is when the team becomes high performing. There's no point in us being a team, Melanie, if we're all going to go work in our separate cubicle.
That's right.
It's getting in the room, as Susan said, and unleashing that innovation, that collective wisdom that Janet mentioned. And then the team has to learn together, and people forget that. Now, any team I've ever led, and I know Janet and Susan are the same way, part of our agenda is making time to learn. Everybody say Lynn is going to overlearn us. We're going to have themes, we're going to read books, we're going to do workshops, but we're going to learn and have the knowledge to achieve the strategy. And then, 5 is encouraging the heart and making appreciation. Sometimes we get so caught up, especially as women, we're juggling 10 balls. We forget to show the gratitude for our team and spending that time to have fun, joy, and show gratitude. And then finally, the team has to be psychologically safe. Okay, that's a big buzzword, research word that I write about, but it really is about people feel they can be authentic, and you can have those brave and courageous conversations, and that we have each other's back.
As you were talking about those, and they're also important, I was thinking about when I give feedback for improvement, particularly for folks who have progressed very quickly in their career, and they make this transition from being a very high performing individual contributor into their first leadership role. And so these things become really important, but there's this toggle because they're used to crossing, the baseline on their own intellect and talent. And it's really hard. And I was talking to a team about this last week, as a manager, you don't win until you cross with everybody. And
Exactly.
So if you get there first and you're looking to your left and you're looking to your right and nobody's with you, it's not that you were so smart, and maybe you were, But if you didn't bring people along with you and you didn't all cross, the finish line at the same time, you should really stop and take stock of what didn't happen. And I think like these 6 things that you're talking about, like really point to that, but people don't realize it, particularly like when they initially get into the leadership role.
Exactly.
Yeah,
And
for
so,
me, it was the first time I really appreciated that was when I was in a role where I did not have the content myself to be able to do the work. And that's really
yeah.
what forced me to realize that you can't just run faster and or sort of will everyone along the way with you, because I was in a place where I did not have the content to do it myself. And that was a huge learning moment for me that I've thought a lot about as we've been putting this together.
Janet, it was that stretch assignment. It was that disruptor to your
Yes,
career. And
exactly.
then you had to
Exactly,
learn how to
Lynn.
lead a team.
Yes. Well, and as women, we've become very achievement focused because we win, because we achieve, and we don't recognize some of these other skills that are necessary to bring people along, to get to like the psychological safety that's, really necessary. And if we even dig into psychological safety, like why is it a key ingredient in developing a healthy team dynamic?
So I'll speak to that. This was, the entire practice chapter about developing a healthy team environment is based on the 6 actions that Lynn just reviewed. And the 6th one is psychological safety. And what we realized was the other 5 don't work if you don't have psychological safety. So what is this? And I want to make sure everyone knows the premise of it, although this is like preaching to the choir, because of course you probably know that we reference Google's Project Aristotle in the book, which as you know, followed the success of Google's Project Oxygen research, where the people analytics team studied what makes a great manager. They then turned to apply a similar method to discover the secrets of effective teaming. And it was codenamed Project Aristotle to tribute to Aristotle's quote around the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. But what was really interesting is y'all asked what makes a team effective at Google. And the research found that the most important variable of working together effectively was this presence of psychological safety. Specifically, I can take risks interpersonally, even I can even make mistakes, or I can say things and say, oh gosh, that didn't come out the way I wanted. And it won't sacrifice my feeling of belonging and my uniqueness and agency to contribute. And so, I joke with my team daily, I wake up every day and with my children, I wake up every day to narrow the gap between my intention and my impact, right? It's having the ability to do that and come back the next day and feel like I can fully contribute. That's psychological safety.
It's such a great, I love the way you characterized it. And, even the part about like, it's okay to make mistakes, because sometimes innovation is stifled because people fear making a mistake, and that looms larger than taking a risk or trying something that you feel is important or you have the instinct about, but then that fear of like not measuring up or failing at it can prevent like some really great ideas. And so that psychological safety becomes important, even like with helping people feel like seen and heard and valued. And can you just talk about like the benefits of inclusive spaces? Like what are some of the key benefits of creating more inclusive spaces where everybody feels seen and valued?
So I'll jump in there, Melanie, just to bridge to your comment before your question. This idea of creating the space for innovation is a long game. It's not that we're going to make this a trusting meeting and therefore we're going to come up with a great idea in this meeting. It is over, the days, weeks, months, and or years that teams are working together, that there's the confidence from the safety that Susan and Lynn were talking about. So I just wanted to pull that thread just a little bit. So I started in my very opening comments when we talked about, sort of why this book and why now. But let me just bridge back to this, which is the data shows that when you have diversity in leadership and you create an inclusive culture, teams get stronger, discussions get richer, people get more creative, as we were just talking about, and everyone benefits. And given the complexity of the universe that we're operating in, leaders with a really wide range of expertise and perspectives and experiences cultivate much more diverse thinking, which allows teams and organizations and people to thrive. The best thing I think, however, about this whole conversation is that thriving is contagious. And so whether it's women or men, we've talked a lot about women today, but a lot of what we've talked about is very applicable to men as well. This idea that women and men thriving creates the flywheel effect of others around them capturing that energy and thriving as well. So I really deeply believe that this idea of creating inclusive spaces and teams and organizations has this incredible knock-on effect for everyone involved and engaged. We've talked a little bit about the whole and the sum of the parts today, but I think it's also important to talk about the pie gets bigger. When women thrive, when you have inclusive teams for everyone to thrive, it does create more opportunity versus what can be a stereotype of taking opportunity away. I deeply believe that success begets success.
Mm-hmm.
Thriving is the ambition.
And love that we're thriving. We're not just surviving, we're arriving and thriving. Lynn, I just want to ask you one more question and then we'll, take it home from there. But your call to action since becoming president of Simmons University is for everyday leadership. And just could you talk about how does that connect to inclusive leadership?
So if we are inclusive leaders, we realize that everyone in the room is a leader. And when I conceptualize everyday leader, it's about creating organizational environments where people can show up and be their best selves, and that they're empowering others to be their best selves. And then it's realizing that each of us are called here to do something to the crisis or opportunity of our time. And everyday leaders call and serve upon that. And they think about the power of community and collective wisdoms. And that really is what inclusive leaders are.
Thank you. It's been such a great conversation. Love to leave with each of you talking about what are the key messages that you want our audience to take with them from our conversation today?
Who do you want to start with?
Susan, you go.
All right, I'm gonna boil it down to three. Don't go it alone, right? Just don't go it alone. We weren't meant to. Ask for help, lean on others. The second is your growth is fluid, as is your well-being. So be gentle with it all. I think we women are so hard on ourselves to be so killer at everything that we do. It's like, take a breath. It's okay if it's not done perfectly, and know that we're continually evolving. And then lastly, I already said it, but if you don't remember anything I said, just remember this. The future belongs to the learner. So stay curious, ask more questions. Every situation is more complicated than any one person can see. So it's incumbent upon us to stay in seeking to understand.
Thank you.
Lynn?
So arrive and thrive, we're continuously doing it. It's not like we thrive and then we stop. And so my first thing is this continuous cycle of arrive and thriving. And as you're going through each destination, I kind of think of it as a train station, is give yourself grace, take time to find joy, and really do live that integrative life.
Thank you. Janet.
So Susan said something, actually Susan and Lynn both said really important things. Susan said, don't go it alone. My additional reminder would be you're not in it alone. And it is so easy to feel like, especially in a pandemic, I would have said this pre-pandemic, but especially in where we find ourselves, that you can feel like you're in it alone. And one of the things we really hoped from writing this book, and something I talk a lot about before, during, and I will after this book, is that we're here to help each other be wildly successful and know that you're not in it alone. And we are a resource for you. And know that there are many others like us who are a resource for each of you to help you be your best selves.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to switch to Q&A. We have some in the queue already. The first question is, how have you dealt with gender bias?
I'm happy to jump in first. I grew up at the intersection of technology and Wall Street. So as you can imagine, that was a fairly male-dominated world. And for the early parts of my career, I just ignored it and kept my head down. And that's not something that I'm particularly proud of, but I was just sort of one foot in front of the other, and you do your job and everything turns out. And if you do what you're asked to do, it will all turn out okay. As I've evolved, both my own thinking and understanding, the conversation has evolved and my roles have evolved. I think an enormous amount of the responsibility for all of us as leaders, and I love what Lynn said about that we're all here because we're leaders, is the responsibility to figure out the right courageous way to call out gender bias when you see it. Sometimes that's using humor. I tend to try to use humor to disarm a situation. Sometimes it's behind the scenes. Sometimes it's using an ally. Sometimes it's calling it out in public. But work with your closest sort of cohort of friends and colleagues to figure out how to call the conversation. And if you name it, it can create a very different dynamic. So that's what I have evolved. I wish I could say I had done that for my entire career, but I really tried hard to push my own thinking and the thinking of my teams over time to create a very, very different dynamic in the workplaces that I have responsibility for today.
Janet, I agree about calling it out. And one way to call it out that speaks to people, show the data sometimes. So you verbally call it out, you show the data. We have to make sure women are in the room where it happens, and so that we can lift and climb and bring it to their attention. So those are really big, important things. And then seek mentors have been helpful.
In that same vein, I just have to share this because it works. The likability bias, where you don't even know it, but both men and women, all genders, are sort of making a trade-off with you as women. Like, is she competent or is she likable?
Thank you for that. And Janet, thanks for your vulnerability and transparency, and sharing your personal as well. Okay, so the next question really talks about work-life integration. How can you stay 100% visible and available in professional life in the face of personal trials? And the examples are kids, sickness, caregiving for parents, and mental health, and not lean back in such situations.
I mean, I'm happy to jump in, but I know everyone has a lot to say about this. So I actually don't believe that being always visible and always available is actually the answer to how to lead sort of a happy and productive life that has really important things in your personal life and really important things in your professional life. I will also acknowledge that this is super personal. What works for me might not work for you. I'm a deep believer in borrowing good ideas, but not having role models, because I don't, Melanie, you and I grew up in very different worlds, and the things that you do might not work for me, and the things I do might not work for you. And I've had so much learning in that over the years. What works for me is actually creating pretty strict boundaries and not being 100% on, and being very disconnected when I'm disconnected, especially when my children were younger. I have 25-year-old twins, so I'm in a very different chapter now. But almost everything that the person who asked the question that you listed, I have dealt with in some form or fashion. I was diagnosed with cancer when I was actually in my first big leadership job, about the same day I got that job. My daughter has struggled with some very significant illnesses through her high school years. I have complexities in my parents. I try to be as authentic about what's going on in my life as I can. I really set boundaries for when I'm focused on my family, that is what I'm focused on. And I'm not 100% available and never have been. Frankly, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't have written this book if I'd made the decision to be 100% available, because I would not want to have created that level of compromise. A little bit to Susan's question, I'm a yes and person. As opposed to, both all the time.
Yeah. Janet, I agree for you. My two models are, it takes a village. And so when I think about elder care in my family, I've had a support of a village. When I think about raising my kids, and I think about, I'm very strict about managing my calendar. So I'll give, one personal story is that my daughter was a dancer. And if you know anything about your dance mom, there's certain times you have recitals or competitions. Everyone in the office knew Lynn would not be there because Lynn would be at that particular dance one. Same thing when my son had events. I like to be home when my son was studying for exams. I managed my calendar well. So those were, it took a village. I couldn't have done what I've done in my career and my life without my village and managing my calendar.
I would just say I think we need to learn how to negotiate in the living room if we're going to negotiate in the boardroom. And this is it's going back for asking for help, for being clear about what we need. I'm a fan of outsourcing. When women ask me how do you do it all, I said I don't do it. What makes you think I do it all? I do not do it all. So as I grew in my career and created the affordability to outsource, I made some decisions and I changed my mind about a lot of it over time. So that's the other thing. One of the things that's true about arriving and thriving is that we're constantly assessing and maybe changing. And same thing with authenticity. You know, what we valued when we were in our 20s and 30s might be different in our 40s and 50s. And so it's okay to do it one way and then change it up if it doesn't work and do it another way.
Yeah, life throws so many twists and turns our ways. I mean, certainly many of the things, both amazing and difficult, that have happened in my life were not planned. And that agility is critical. I'll close this part with just a funny story that, Susan, you made me think about negotiating at home. This was probably a decade or so ago, and I was invited, and this is going to sound more dramatic than it was. I was invited to, I'll just say it directly. I was invited to the White House. This was not a personal invitation to me. This was a major event. Lots of people were invited, and my husband and I were invited. And I looked at our home calendar, and it was right before final exams my kid's freshman year in high school. And I was like, well, we're not both going to be gone before my kids' final exams. Like, they need to be home and in their space and not at friends' houses for the weekend. So I just accepted the invitation, declined on my husband's behalf without telling him. And so I will tell you, it was the right decision. But I probably could have negotiated that one a little bit better, Susan, because he would have very much liked to attend that weekend. And this was a division of labor that I said, someone has to be home this weekend, and it's going to be you. And so he still teases me about it to this day. So.
Yep. Outsourcing and dividing labor up. We have to be realistic.
Yep.
All great advice. Okay. Another question. Can you share how you've leveraged strengths-based leadership at work?
For me, my number one strength is communication, and I get to do this. I am a writer and a teacher of leadership and a coach. And so to be able to connect and communicate, it just happens to play to my, one of my core strengths. How about you, Lynn?
So one of my top strengths is maximizer. I'm that type of mom, when the child gets to 99, I'm like, well, what's the one question you got wrong? That's not a good one. But in organizational life, I'm always willing to push my team towards excellence. The other thing I use strengths are, I know that, I think in my head, I'm a learner. And so I put people on my team who are relators, who are going to reach out, do the people work. So I build the team with complementary strengths. I'm always looking for people who have different strengths than me.
I love that. We talk at Google a lot about culture add, versus culture fit, and like, what are the skills that are additive as well.
I love that culture add.
Mm-hmm.
How about you, Janet?
Well, I was going to maybe take a slightly different take on the question, which is, how as a leader do I pull out the strengths of others? And one of the things that I've done for many years, and I did learn early in my career, as opposed to some of the examples I highlighted today, was being very deliberate when I was building a new team, which in professional services, like at Google, often teams can form and reform, and you move teams a lot. So I often had new teams. And having very deliberate conversations with the members of my team in and around what they thought their strengths were, how their strengths could apply to the work in front of us, and what they wanted to grow and develop in terms of both building on their strengths and or places where they wanted to develop where they didn't have strengths. So I very much use that in and around sort of goal setting, expectation setting conversations, and not in filling out, some 12-page form, but sort of in the heart of the matter of conversations with my teams around their strengths and how we could draw on their strengths for the work that was in front of us.
That's great. I mean, there's a question here, and I'll jump in with one answer and then open it up. But she says, as a new Googler, how do I get a mentor? And I'll say the first thing I would recommend is to talk to your manager and let them know what you're seeking in a mentor, and then ask for their help and their network. You could also talk to your a person in our HR team as well, like one of our people consultants. But Janet, Lynn, Susan, what's your recommendation?
I would advise both following your advice, Melanie, but I would also think about looking for people that you admire something about them. I talked about not being a giant fan of role models, but I admire a lot in people. The key to mentorship, so if you find someone that you admire, the key to mentorship is thinking about what's in it for both of you. Right. And what's on that person's agenda that you can help with, and vice versa. So those are the things I really encourage people to think about when they want to really build a mentoring relationship. And I will trust you that everyone who's here with us today or listening to this, there's something I could learn from you and there's something you could learn from me. And I'm never confused about that. So when people come to me in that vein, that's the mindset that I bring to the conversation. And when I want to be mentored, the same.
Thank you for sharing that. We have one more question. And it says, throughout your careers, what advice has motivated and or helped you to grow in a personal or professional level?
I can start, and it builds upon something Janice said when she said she is not a but person, she's an and person. Women tend to say no a lot when that next career move comes. And one of the best people advices I got was, instead of saying no, say yes, and what you need to do to say yes. So yes, and this is how I'm going to do it.
Probably the best piece of advice I've received, and this is for you extroverts out there who have exuberant energy, is to pay attention to the energy. When you walk into a room, I sometimes have to picture reaching out, to the energy that's 3 feet in front of my body and rein it in, because I get excited. And so our energy, how we speak, how we show up, it really impacts others. And that advice helped me to be just more conscious of not everybody is excited by excited. Right. So paying attention to my energy was probably one of the better pieces of advice I've gotten.
I'll close us with one of our practices around authenticity. And the advice that I got earlier in my career is, how you do anything is how you do everything. Consistency in how you show up in your interactions with a wide variety of people in a wide variety of settings is about being authentic. And that consistency gives you the ability to tackle so many different things through this mindset that everyone has, that they know what to expect when you get there. And that is incredibly thoughtful and consistent, regardless of the situation that you find yourself in.
Thank you. Thank you for such a tremendous conversation. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure and privilege, truly.